Imagine waking up one morning and watching your neighbor walk out of her front door, step into the middle of the street, and start dancing. No music playing, no celebration happening, no reason you can see. She just begins to move, slowly at first, then frantically, her arms cutting through the air, her feet slapping the cobblestones in a rhythm only she can hear. You watch. You wait for her to stop. She doesn't stop. Her husband comes out and grabs her arms and begs her to come back inside. She pulls away and keeps dancing. The sun goes down. The night passes. The sun comes up again. And she is still there in the street, her shoes soaked through with blood from where her feet have worn raw, still dancing, still unable to stop, her eyes open but seeing nothing you can see. Now imagine that the next day, 3 of your other neighbors walk out of their doors and do exactly the same thing. And the day after that, 10 more. And the day after that, 30. And within a month, you are living in a city where 400 of your friends, your family members, your fellow citizens are dancing in the streets against their will, some of them collapsing from exhaustion, some of them suffering heart attacks, some of them dying while still in motion. The doctors don't know what it is. The priests don't know what it is. The government doesn't know what it is. And every solution they try makes it worse. This is not a folktale. This is not a legend invented by monks to frighten children. This is one of the most thoroughly documented events in the history of Western civilization, and it happened in the summer of 1518 in the city of Strasbourg. And by the time you finish watching this video, you are going to understand not just what happened there, but why. And you are going to recognize that the force that destroyed that city is still operating today, right now, in the world you live in. You just call it something different. Let's go back to the beginning. Not to July of 1518, but further, because the story of the dancing plague does not begin on the day the dancing started. It begins years earlier, in the slow, grinding collapse of everything an ordinary person depended on to make life feel survivable. To understand what happened in Strasbourg, you have to understand what it actually felt like to live there, not in the way history books describe it, but in the way a man with a family and a trade and a house would have felt it in his body, in his chest, in the part of himself he never spoke out loud about. Because that unspoken part is exactly where this story lives. Strasbourg in the early 1500s sat in what is now northeastern France, a prosperous trading city on the Rhine River, home to skilled craftsmen, weavers, tanners, blacksmiths, merchants, people who built things with their hands and expected that hard work would be enough. For a long time it was, but by 1518, the ground had been shifting under their feet for years. The harvests across the Rhine Valley had failed repeatedly. Not once, not twice, repeatedly. Families who had fed themselves and their children for generations were going hungry in ways they had never experienced. The grain stores were low. The prices for bread were rising beyond what working people could afford. And layered on top of that hunger was disease, smallpox moving through neighborhoods, taking children and elders without warning, and syphilis, a disease so new and so poorly understood that people had no framework to explain it, no name for what it was doing to bodies, no medicine that came close to treating it. The Black Death had already carved through Europe not long before, and the fear of sudden mass death was not an abstract historical memory for these people. It was a lived experience they carried in their bones every single day. And then there was the church. For centuries, the Catholic Church had been the one institution that gave structure to suffering. If your harvest failed, there was a prayer for that. If your child died, there was a ritual for that. If you were afraid, there was a saint for that. The church told you what your fear meant and what to do about it. And that container, however imperfect, was the only one most people had. But by 1518, even that container was cracking apart. A monk named Martin Luther had just published his challenge to Catholic doctrine the year before, and the theological earthquake he triggered was already being felt in cities like Strasbourg. The institution people had always trusted to hold their terror together was itself coming apart at the seams. The priests were fighting each other. The theologians were publicly disagreeing. The old certainties were no longer certain. And ordinary people, the tanners and the weavers and the mothers with sick children, were left holding all of that fear with no place to put it. Before we go any further, we would love to know where you are watching this from. Drop your city or your country in the comments right now. This channel reaches people all over the world, and we genuinely want to hear from you. And if this is the kind of story that makes you lean forward in your seat, hit that subscribe button. We make these videos for people who want to understand the patterns underneath history, and there are many more coming. Now, back to Strasbourg, because it is July 14th, 1518, and something is about to happen on a narrow cobblestone street that will change this city forever. Her name in the historical record is recorded as Frau Trophia. That is the only name history gave her, a title and a surname. No first name, no age, no description of her face. For the purposes of this story, let's call her Margaret. Margaret Trophia, a woman in Strasbourg, a woman with a husband, a woman who woke up on a Tuesday morning in the middle of July and walked out of her front door and into the street and began to dance. There was no music. There was no festival. Her husband watched from the doorway as she turned and stepped, her feet marking a rhythm only she could hear. "Crazy alchemist," he called to her. She didn't answer. He walked out and put his hands on her shoulders and tried to stop her. She pulled away. He went back inside. He came back out. She was still dancing. Neighbors stopped and stared. Some of them laughed, thinking she was drunk, thinking she had lost her mind for a moment, thinking it would pass. It did not pass. She continued dancing uncontrollably all day until she collapsed. Her husband begged her to stop, but she began dancing again the next day on swollen, bloody feet. National Geographic. She danced for 6 days before anyone in authority took it seriously. 6 days of a woman in the street, moving against her will, her body conducting some inner storm that she apparently could not control and could not stop. The historical accounts describe her as not performing for anyone, not responding to conversation, not appearing to want to be seen. She was not putting on a show. She was trapped. And the word that runs through every account written by witnesses who saw her during those first days is not mockery and not amusement. It is fear. The people who watched Margaret dance were afraid of what they were seeing, in the way that people are afraid when something happens that does not fit any category they have been given, when something happens that their world has no name for. And that namelessness, that gap between the event and any framework to explain it, is one of the most important details of this entire story. Remember it. We are coming back to it. Within a week, 30 other individuals in the city had also begun to dance. History skills. 30 people who had watched Margaret in the street or heard about her from someone who had, and who then felt something happen in their own bodies. A compulsion, a pull, an irresistible movement that began in the legs and spread upward and would not be argued with or reasoned away. These were not people who knew each other particularly well. They were spread across different streets, different trades, different households. Some were women, some were men, some were young, some were older. What they shared was not a relationship with Margaret, but a relationship with the same crushing, wordless weight that she had been carrying. The hunger, the disease, the fear, the theological chaos, the complete absence of any legitimate place to put what they were feeling. And now, watching her body do what their inner world wanted to do, something in them broke open. Within 2 weeks, the number had climbed past 100. The City Council of Strasbourg, a governing body of merchants and magistrates who kept careful written records of everything they deliberated, records that still survive in the Strasbourg archives today, convened emergency sessions. City authorities were alarmed by the ever-increasing number of dancers. They kept going long past the point of injury. Encyclopedia Britannica, the council summoned physicians and asked them to examine the afflicted and give a medical opinion. The physicians examined the dancers and delivered their verdict. and that verdict has to be understood in the context of the medical thinking of the time. They were working from a theory of disease that had been dominant for 1,000 years, the theory of the four humors, the idea that illness was caused by an imbalance of fluids in the body, most commonly by blood that had become too hot, too thick, or too abundant. The Strasbourg City Council, based on the humoral theory of the time, believed that dancing was caused by overheated blood and advised that the afflicted should dance themselves to health. Curie Encyclopedia. Read that again. The city's official medical position was that the cure for compulsive, uncontrollable dancing was more dancing. If the blood was overheated, the theory went, then vigorous movement would sweat out the excess heat, the balance would be restored, and the afflicted would recover. It was, within the framework of what these physicians believed about the human body, a logical conclusion. It was also one of the most catastrophic public health decisions ever committed to paper. Because what the council did next, on the basis of that medical advice, was not just allow the dancing to continue. They actively facilitated it. Authorities constructed wooden stages in the horse and grain markets and hired musicians to play drums, fiddles, pipes, and horns. They even recruited healthy dancers to encourage the afflicted, believing vigorous movement would purge the illness from their systems. Feed your curiosity. Think carefully about what that means. A city government, watching hundreds of its citizens dancing themselves toward death, responded by building a stage and hiring a band. They turned the private suffering of individuals into a public spectacle at the center of the busiest market in the city. They surrounded the afflicted with professional musicians playing drums and pipes, day and night, filling the air with exactly the kind of rhythmic pulse that a body in the grip of compulsive movement would find impossible to resist. And they brought in healthy people who were not yet dancing, and put them in the middle of the spectacle with instructions to model the behavior they were supposedly trying to cure. By turning private suffering into public performance, the city may have amplified the contagion. More people saw the dancers. More people heard the music. More people absorbed the fear. The city unintentionally created a stage for social contagion. Rivlock's magazine. And the numbers climbed. 50, 100, 200, 300. And then, at the peak of the outbreak, by the accounts of multiple contemporary chroniclers, the dancing plague had claimed somewhere between 400 and, by some estimates, more. Not everyone who danced died. Many collapsed from exhaustion and then recovered, at least physically. But the records mention strokes, heart failure, and exhaustion of the limbs. One chronicle estimates 15 deaths per day at the plague's peak. Crazy alchemist, people were dying. Not from a sword, not from a plague bacterium, not from poison, from dancing. From their own bodies, driven by something invisible and relentless, moving until the heart gave out. And the stage was still there. The musicians were still playing. The council was still meeting and deliberating and writing careful notes in the margins of their official records. Notes like this one, which still exists in the Strasbourg archives. A single line from the city council's expense records reading. For the musicians who played for the dancers, 2 florins. By this point, the city of Strasbourg was, by any reasonable definition, in a state of collective breakdown. The guilds had stopped functioning normally because too many of their members were either dancing or watching the dancers. Normal commerce had slowed. People who were not afflicted were terrified of becoming so, afraid to walk past the stage, afraid to hear the music, afraid that whatever invisible force had taken their neighbors might reach out and take them too. And the authorities, having made the situation measurably worse with their first response, were now facing a different kind of pressure, not just the practical crisis of managing hundreds of people dancing themselves to death, but a crisis of meaning. Because the question that was eating at everyone in the city, the question that ran beneath every council meeting and every physician consultation and every prayer whispered in private, was not a medical question. It was a theological one. Why is God doing this to us? because that is how the people of Strasbourg understood what was happening. They did not have a concept of psychological illness. They did not have a vocabulary for collective trauma or mass psychogenic disorder. What they had was a theology that explained suffering in one of two ways. Either God was punishing you, or the devil was attacking you. And both of those explanations pointed in the same direction, toward the church, toward the saints, toward ritual and prayer and supernatural intervention. It was at this point that the dominant explanation began to shift from a medical one to a religious one. The dancing, it was increasingly said, was a curse. And not just any curse. It was the specific curse of a specific saint whose legend was deeply woven into the religious culture of the region. His name was Saint Vitus, and his story is one of the most important keys to understanding what happened in Strasbourg. Saint Vitus was a Catholic saint who pious 16th-century Europeans believed had the power to curse people with a dancing plague. When combined with the horrors of disease and famine, both of which were tearing through Strasbourg in 1518, the St. History, Vitus framework gave people a container for the incomprehensible, a shape they could point at, pray toward, and build a ritual response around. Saint Vitus was a young Christian martyr from the 3rd century, a boy, by most accounts, who was thrown into a cauldron of boiling oil for refusing to renounce his faith and who, by the miracle attributed to him, emerged unburned. He became associated with dancers and with those afflicted by nervous disorders, partly because of the connection between his feast day and traditional dances that had been performed in his honor, and partly because his name had been attached to previous outbreaks of involuntary movement going back well over a century. People called it St. Vitus's dance, and the name carried with it an entire interpretive framework, one that told the sufferer and everyone around them exactly what this was, exactly who was responsible for it, and exactly what needed to be done about it. You needed to travel to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, perform the prescribed rituals, pray for his mercy, and ask him to lift the curse. The saint was the explanation, the saint was the problem, and the saint was the cure. For a population with no other framework available, this was not superstition. It was the only coherent story on offer. Priests performed elaborate rituals, placing red shoes painted with crosses on the dancers' feet, sprinkling holy water, and burning incense while chanting Latin prayers. Feed your curiosity. Margaret Troffea herself, the woman who had started it all, was sent to the shrine of Saint Vitus in the nearby town of Saverne. The shrine rituals were performed over her. Whether she stopped dancing there or whether she had already stopped by that point, the historical record does not clearly say. What the record does say is that the city eventually made the decision to transport groups of dancers out of Strasbourg entirely to the mountaintop shrine at Saverne, to have the religious remedies administered away from the city center, away from the musicians and the stage, away from the eyes of those who had not yet been afflicted. And gradually, across the weeks that followed, the dancing slowed. By September, Strasbourg's streets were quiet. The wooden stage was dismantled. The musicians went home. Crazy alchemist, the plague, which had consumed an entire city for nearly 2 months, simply stopped. No physician announced a cure. No council decree ended it. No single intervention can be pointed to as the turning point. It dissolved, the way it had begun, without a clean explanation, without a ceremony to mark its end, without anyone in authority being able to say with confidence what had happened or why it had stopped. The city went back to being a city. The dead were buried. The survivors recovered as best they could. And the chronicles and the council minutes and the physician reports were filed away in archives where they would sit for centuries, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Now, here is where this story stops being about Strasbourg and starts being about you, about the world you live in and the forces that move through it. Because what happened in Strasbourg in 1518 was not a medieval anomaly. It was not a primitive response confined to an era before science or reason. It was one of the most well-documented examples of a phenomenon that has appeared in every century since and is operating with greater speed and reach today than at any point in human history. The name modern scientists and psychologists give it is mass psychogenic illness. And the more you understand about how it actually works, its mechanics, its conditions, its triggers, the more uncomfortable you are going to be. Because the pattern is not subtle. Once you see it, you will see it everywhere. Mass psychogenic illness, or MPI, is defined by researchers as the rapid spread of illness signs and symptoms affecting members of a cohesive group, originating from a nervous system disturbance involving excitation, loss, or alteration of function, where physical illness has been ruled out as a cause. In plain language, it is what happens when the collective psychological pressure of a group finds a physical outlet. The body, denied any legitimate language for the fear it is carrying, translates that fear into symptoms. And those symptoms spread not through bacteria or viruses, but through observation, through social proximity, through the invisible transmission of shared emotion. The medical historian who has done more than anyone else to explain the Strasbourg dancing plague to modern audiences is a scholar named Dr. James Waller, and his research builds what he describes as a sequence of conditions that must be present for a mass psychogenic event to occur. The conditions are a closed or cohesive social group, an experience of extreme collective stress or fear, the absence of any legitimate outlet for that fear, and a triggering event, a single person or incident that gives the group permission to express what it has been holding back. Every one of those conditions was present in Strasbourg in July of 1518. The city was a closed community. The collective stress, famine, disease, theological collapse was extreme and sustained. The cultural prohibition against open expressions of grief or fear was total. And Margaret Trophia, walking out of her front door and beginning to dance, was the trigger. But here is what makes this genuinely unsettling, and what the mainstream telling of this story almost always misses. The same four conditions appeared in Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692. They appeared in a textile factory in Tennessee in 1962. They appeared in a high school in LeRoy, New York, in 2011. And they are appearing right now, in the digital landscape of the 21st century, with effects that no city council has any idea how to manage. Let's go through them in sequence, because the pattern is not vague. It is precise, and precision is what makes it terrifying. Salem, Massachusetts, 1692. By 1692, the Puritan colony of Salem Village, a small, deeply religious community in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, was under a pressure that maps almost exactly onto the Strasbourg profile. A recent war with local indigenous nations had left the community traumatized. Smallpox was present. There were unresolved land disputes between families that had been generating conflict and resentment for years. The colony had recently lost its original charter and was in a state of political uncertainty about its own legal status. And overarching all of it was a theology even more rigid than the Catholicism of medieval Strasbourg, a Calvinist worldview that interpreted every hardship as either divine punishment or demonic attack, that left no room for doubt, no room for grief without cause, and no room for fear without a target. The social container was sealed tight. The hysteria that gripped Salem Village resulted in the execution of 20 people and the imprisonment of many more. It serves as a stark reminder of how psychological epidemics can have very real and tragic consequences. CBDV. It began with two girls. A 9-year-old girl named Betty Paris, the daughter of the local minister, and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams, began experiencing what witnesses described as fits, convulsions, crying out, contorted postures, claims of being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. A local physician examined them and found no physical cause. His conclusion, The only conclusion available to him in the interpretive world he inhabited was that they were suffering from witchcraft. And with that single word, the trigger was pulled. The community had a container for its collective fear now. It had a target, and the symptoms spread. More girls began experiencing fits. The accusations began. A slave woman named Tituba confessed under pressure to practicing witchcraft. More names followed. The machinery of accusation, once started, fed itself. Because in a closed community under extreme collective stress, the social rewards for participation in the collective story can become stronger than the individual risk of stepping outside it. By the time the governor of Massachusetts finally halted the proceedings, 20 people had been executed. The dancing had a different shape in Salem. It wore the shape of testimony and confession and hanging. But the mechanism was the same. Now go forward almost 300 years. Leroy, New York. Fall of 2011. Leroy is a small town in upstate New York. About 7,000 people, a tight-knit community, a high school where everyone knows each other's families. On October 21st, 2011, the Genesee County Health Department informed the New York State Department of Health that 8 students at the Leroy Junior-Senior High School had recently developed neurologic tic symptoms. By mid-December, 12 girls at the Leroy Junior-Senior High School had reported symptoms. Wikipedia: the tics were involuntary, visible, distressing to the students experiencing them, sudden jerking movements, verbal outbursts, symptoms that resembled Tourette's syndrome, but that appeared with a speed and in a cluster that no neurologist could explain through any biological mechanism. The health department tested the school building for environmental toxins. They found nothing. State health officials investigated. They found nothing. Parents were frightened and angry. The girls were frightened and distressed. And then something happened that no one in Strasbourg in 1518 could have imagined. The story went on social media. Within days of the first news reports, the story had spread across the country. The girls' symptoms were filmed and shared on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. And cases of motor hysteria seemed to be on the rise again in Western societies, with the Leroy case described as a case of mass psychogenic illness and the first such case in which reports of affected individuals spread via social networks. OZY, the same dynamic that had spread the dancing in Strasbourg by putting the afflicted on a stage in the city market. Visibility, normalization, the social reinforcement of the behavior, was now being conducted at the speed of the internet, with a potential audience not of 400 but of 40 million. The mechanism was 500 years old. The transmission infrastructure was 21st century. And the result was, by every clinical assessment that followed, a modern mass psychogenic event playing out in real time, in a country that considered itself the most scientifically literate civilization in history, in a community of ordinary American families who had never heard of the Strasbourg dancing plague and would have been deeply offended by any comparison. Here is the question that the researchers who study mass psychogenic illness keep coming back to, the one that the mainstream accounts of these events almost never ask loudly enough. Why does this keep happening? Not why did it happen in Strasbourg or Salem or Leroy specifically. The specific conditions of each case are well documented. The deeper question is, why does the human social organism keep producing this same pattern across 5 centuries of radically different technology, culture, religion, and scientific understanding? Why does the pressure cooker keep appearing? Why does the trigger keep working? Why does the dancing never fully stop? The answer that the research points toward is not comfortable. It suggests that mass psychogenic illness is not a failure of rationality. It is not a symptom of ignorance. It is not something that disappears when a society becomes educated or modern. It is, instead, a feature of human collective psychology, a release mechanism that activates specifically when a community under sustained stress loses access to legitimate channels for expressing and processing its fear. The key word is legitimate. Not just any expression, legitimate expression. Expression that is socially permitted, institutionally acknowledged, collectively validated. And what the historical record shows, with a consistency that cannot be explained away, is that every society in which MPI has appeared on a significant scale has also been a society that, for reasons of religion, politics, economics, or cultural norms, actively suppressed the legitimate expression of collective fear. In Strasbourg, you were not allowed to say, "We are starving and we are terrified and we cannot carry this anymore." In Salem, you were not allowed to say, "We are traumatized and exhausted and we are afraid of everything, including each other." In Leroy, the girls experiencing symptoms were living in a community where adolescent psychological distress was not being named, validated, or addressed at any institutional level. The containers were different. The pressure was different. The specific fears were different. But the suppression, the closing off of legitimate expression, was the same. And when suppression reaches a threshold, the body finds another way. It always has. It always will. This is why the scholars who have studied this most carefully, researchers like Dr. James Waller, sociologist Robert Bartholomew, and historian Eric Middelfort, are so insistent that the dancing plague must not be treated as a curiosity from a more ignorant era. Because the condescension built into that framing, the implicit assumption that we, unlike those dancing peasants, are too rational to lose our collective minds, is itself one of the conditions that makes the next outbreak more likely, not less. The belief that it cannot happen here, that we are beyond it, that our institutions are robust enough and our science is sophisticated enough to prevent this kind of collective break, that belief is part of the pressure seal. And pressure seals, as Strasbourg in 1518 demonstrated with extraordinary clarity, do not hold forever. There is one more layer to this story that I want you to think about before we close, because it is the layer that connects the dancing plague not just to psychology, but to something older, to the way human beings have always used myth and story and symbol to manage what they cannot manage any other way. Go back to St. Vitus. Go back to the moment when the people of Strasbourg looked at what was happening in their streets and reached for the only explanatory container they had, the story of a martyred saint with the power to curse dancers. From a modern perspective, that looks like superstition. It looks like primitive thinking, like the mental equivalent of the city council building a stage and hiring a band. It looks like the wrong answer. But I want to suggest to you that it was also, in a profound and underappreciated sense, the right answer, just expressed in the only language available. What the St. Vitus story did for the people of Strasbourg was give the collective experience a shape. It gave it a name. It gave it a cause and a cure and a ritual process. It took something that was formless and overwhelming and threatening to dissolve the social fabric entirely and gave it a container that the community could act on together. The shrine at Saverne gave people a destination. The red shoes painted with crosses gave people something to do with their hands. The incense and the holy water and the Latin prayers gave people a shared language for an experience that had been, up to that point, speechless. And whatever the mechanism of recovery actually was, whether it was the removal of the dancers from the stage and the musicians, whether it was the natural exhaustion of the outbreak, whether it was the simple act of being taken seriously and given a ritual that acknowledged their suffering, the fact is that the people who went to Saverne eventually stopped dancing. The myth worked, not because it was literally true, but because it gave the community a way to hold what had broken open. Every culture that has ever experienced mass psychogenic illness has done this. The dancing mania of the 14th century along the Rhine was attributed to demonic possession. The Salem convulsions were attributed to witchcraft. The Leroy tics were attributed, in various public accounts, to environmental toxins, to Panda syndrome, to vaccination side effects. Every explanation except the one the clinical evidence actually supported, because the true explanation was too uncomfortable for a modern community to accept about itself. The myth changes its costume in every century. The function never changes. It is always performing the same service, giving collective fear a face it can look at without being destroyed by what it sees. Here is where this ends, but not where the pattern ends. The pattern does not end. In September of 1518, the last of the dancers was carried to the shrine at Saverne. The rituals were performed, and the dancing stopped. The city of Strasbourg went back to the business of being a city. The council minutes returned to routine matters, trade disputes, tax collection, the maintenance of city walls. The musicians packed up their instruments and went home. The wooden stage was dismantled, the boards reused for something ordinary and forgettable. Margaret Troffea, the woman who had walked out of her door on a Tuesday morning and started it all, disappears from the historical record entirely after her visit to Saverne. We do not know what happened to her. We do not know if she ever spoke about those 6 days in the street, or if anyone ever asked her what it had felt like from the inside. History recorded her as a trigger and then moved on. But the conditions that produced what she triggered did not move on. The famine continued. The disease continued. The theological disruption continued. The weight that had found no legitimate channel of expression before the dancing began did not dissolve when the dancing stopped. It went back underground, the way it always does. Back into the silence between people who share a fear they are not permitted to name. Back into the body. Back into the place where the next outbreak waits. The dancing plague of 1518 was the most fatal and best documented of the more than 10 such contagions which had broken out along the Rhine and Moselle rivers since 1374. The Public Domain Review, 10 documented outbreaks. Same river valley. Same pressure. Same silence. Different years. And if you extend the pattern beyond the Rhine Valley and across 5 centuries, the number stops being 10 and starts being something large enough to be genuinely disturbing. The dancing never stopped. It just changed its shape. It changed its costume, the way the myths always do, and walked back into the streets of a different city in a different century, wearing different clothes, carrying the same weight, waiting for the same trigger, moving to the same invisible rhythm. The question this history is asking you, not with curiosity, but with urgency, is not whether the dancing can happen again. It already has. It is happening. The question is whether you live in a community where fear can be named out loud, whether the institutions around you acknowledge collective suffering before it finds another exit, whether the stage is being built again by well-meaning people with the best available information, making the same catastrophic error that the Strasbourg City Council made in the summer of 1518, the error of managing the symptom while sealing the container tighter. We find the pattern's history try to hide. This was one of them, and now you cannot unsee it. Think about that, and then drop your answer in the comments. What do you think the modern equivalent of the dancing plague is? Not the one that happened 500 years ago in a medieval city, the one that is happening right now, the one that people around you are inside of without knowing it. I want to read every response. And if this video opened something up for you, if it made you see something you had not seen before, then you already know what to do. Subscribe. Share it with someone who asks the right questions. Because the next video goes somewhere even darker than this one, and you will want to be here when it drops. The Pattern Weavers. We find the pattern's history try to hide.